In the quiet hours of the evening, when the world begins to settle and the last traces of daylight slip beneath the horizon, there is a particular stillness that invites curiosity. It is a time when the mind softens, when thoughts slow, and when forgotten stories begin to rise gently from the depths of memory. In that softened landscape, imagine a dimly lit room, a private archive, long undisturbed, where the air carries the faint scent of aging paper and time-worn cardboard. Along the walls, shelves stretch outward like the ribs of an ancient vessel, each lined with files whose edges curl with age. On one central table rests a battered metal box, quiet and unassuming, yet carrying within it the weight of decades. It bears a simple label, slightly faded: NICAP. There's something calming about the idea of archives, especially at night. The notion that secrets and histories can rest beneath layers of dust, untouched, waiting patiently for someone to reopen them. The National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena was not a fringe group, nor a loose collection of enthusiasts. It was a respected organization whose members included retired military officers, commercial pilots, scientists, engineers, and cautious but curious researchers. Their work began in the 1950s at a time when the world was already shifting under the quiet pressure of the Cold War, and the sky itself became a domain of anxiety, defense, and endless observation. Every light, every radar blip, every unidentified shape carried the potential for both danger and discovery. As you imagine the room, notice that nothing is rushed. Even the motion of opening the box is gentle, as though disturbing it too quickly would scatter the past like dust motes. Inside lie 10 folders, some thicker than others, some marked with cryptic shorthand, some nearly empty except for a few clipped reports. These are not the famous cases you hear discussed on documentaries or late-night talk shows. These are the forgotten ones, the ones that never gained traction in mainstream coverage, but were taken seriously by the investigators who handle them. One can picture those investigators working quietly at their desks decades ago, typing careful notes, double-checking statements from eyewitnesses, comparing radar logs, and filing away each curious moment into these very folders. There is a kind of reverence in touching these documents now, even in imagination. The room remains still, the hum of distant streetlights, outside the only reminder of the present. Here, the past feels close enough to touch. Each file represents a moment when someone, perhaps a pilot high in the night sky, perhaps a farmer on a quiet stretch of land, saw something they could not explain. Some of those witnesses were steady professionals, trained to observe, used to stress, and not easily startled. Others were ordinary people going about their day or evening, suddenly confronted with lights or shapes that defied their expectations. Whether one believes in extraterrestrials or not, the sincerity of these accounts and the care with which NICAP documented them offer a calm sense of legitimacy. They are mysteries, but they are grounded mysteries. As the first folder is lifted from the box, a small drift of dust rises, scattering like soft mist. It invites a pause, an inhalation, an exhalation. These cases are not about sensationalist thrills or dramatic revelations. They unfold slowly, with the quiet patience of investigators who believed that careful observation mattered. Part of what makes these stories relaxing is the knowledge that they come from a time before the noise of digital speculation, before social media distortions, before the flood of modern conspiracy theories. These files were assembled by people who valued measured analysis, by people who sent letters to radar stations and airlines, who traveled to interview witnesses in person, who compared handwritten statements line by line. There is something soothing about re-entering that era. The world then moved more slowly, or at least the documentation of it did. When a sighting occurred, there were follow-up letters, telegrams, typed interviews, filed in chronological order. Investigators waited days or weeks for information to arrive. They did not leap to dramatic conclusions. They were cautious, careful, sometimes overly skeptical, sometimes quietly astonished. In reopening these forgotten files, you step into that thoughtful pacing. It becomes possible to experience not the urgency of mystery, but the gentleness of contemplation. Imagine yourself now sitting at that table, the room dim but warm, the quiet weight of history surrounding you. The first file rests before you, It's paper crisp in some places, brittle in others. Its contents hold moments once considered significant enough to raise questions within NICAP's inner circles. Moments discussed during late-night phone calls or cross-checked against flight logs. Yet somehow, over time, these cases never reached wider audiences. They slipped between the cracks of public attention. They remained here, silently waiting. As you prepare to look inside, you may notice how the soft quiet of the room blends with a sense of wonder. Not the sharp wonder of shock or excitement, but a gentle curiosity that invites relaxation. You are not here to solve anything. You are not here to reach absolute conclusions. Instead, you are simply opening a window into a past where observation mattered, where sincerity mattered, and where the mysteries of the sky were approached with both humility and care. In this atmosphere, each forgotten case becomes less about answers and more about presence, an experience of listening to the voices of another time. And as the stillness deepens, the boundary between past and present dissolves slightly, allowing you to drift slowly into the unfolding narrative, calm and unhurried, ready to follow each file wherever it leads. During the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the world lived under a sky that felt heavy with tension. Nations watched one another from orbit and from the edges of radar screens, each side fearful of what the other might place in the air above them. It was in this climate of vigilance that NICAP quietly established itself as one of the most serious civilian organizations ever to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena. Rather than approaching the subject with excitement or sensationalism, its members brought the steady calm of professionals who understood aviation, engineering, and the delicate balance of national security. In those days, the notion of a UFO was not simply a curiosity. It was a potential threat, a possible foreign craft, or an unrecognized technological leap. The stakes were far higher than the public often realized. The Cold War had created an environment in which the air was constantly monitored. Radar systems expanded across the United States, continental defense networks stretched into the Arctic, and pilots were trained to identify aircraft at a glance. This saturation of surveillance meant that sightings carried an unusual weight. If a pilot reported an unidentified object, it was taken seriously because that pilot spent countless hours above the ground and knew the difference between a star, an aircraft, and something that did not match any known pattern. NICAP emerged not as a fringe organization, but as a counterweight to the official government channels, particularly the United States Air Force and its investigative body, Project Blue Book. While Blue Book often leaned toward conventional explanations, NICAP believed that too many cases were being dismissed without proper analysis. The credibility of NICAP rested on its people. Retired military officers with impeccable records, radar operators familiar with the subtleties of signal behavior, commercial pilots who logged thousands of flight hours, scientists who approached data methodically. These were the minds that shaped the organization's approach. They brought with them an understanding of how the sky behaved and what could realistically appear on radar scopes. When one of them encountered a case that challenged those expectations, their concern was not driven by fantasy, but by the possibility of a hidden technological presence. For them, an unexplained aerial object was not a story. It was a puzzle requiring careful thought. This mindset slowly built the organization's reputation as a reliable and serious contributor to the national conversation on aerial phenomena. At the time, public interest in UFOs was growing, fed partly by newspaper reports and partly by a cultural fascination with space exploration. But for many officials and scientists, these stories lacked evidence. NICAP sought to fill that gap, gathering data that went beyond eyewitness testimony whenever possible. They collected radar documentation, photographs, flight logs, weather reports, and measurements from trained observers. Their files often included diagrams drawn by pilots, technical analyses written in calm, precise language, and comparative charts matching sightings with known aircraft behavior. This level of detail was a major reason why the organization influenced several congressional inquiries. They were not trying to stir public fear. They wanted transparency, access to data, and recognition that certain cases remained unresolved despite careful examination. Still, NICAP and the Air Force often disagreed. and those disagreements became part of the broader tension of the era. The Air Force, tasked with maintaining national security and public calm, sometimes leaned toward explanations that fit a predictable pattern. Weather balloons, misidentified aircraft, clouds interacting with light. These were common conclusions. Yet NICAP investigators would often point out inconsistencies between eyewitness reports and official explanations. They questioned why some radar traces disappeared from records, why certain files were classified, and why pilots occasionally reported being instructed not to discuss their sightings. The contrast between civilian transparency and military secrecy created a quiet but persistent conflict, one that shaped many of the forgotten cases lying within NICAP's archives. Psychologically, this period was marked by a unique mixture of fear and curiosity. The space race fueled imagination, while nuclear competition fueled anxiety. People looked at the night sky differently, wondering not only about foreign threats, but also about the possibility of life beyond Earth. Scientists debated privately whether unidentified aerial phenomena represented natural atmospheric events, experimental aircraft, or something beyond human technology. Civilians, meanwhile, interpreted unexplained lights according to their personal beliefs. Some felt awe, some felt fear, and others felt a quiet acceptance that the world still held mysteries beyond easy explanation. NICAP operated at the intersection of these emotional landscapes, trying to remain grounded even as the subject invited speculation. As the organization grew, so did its archive. Letters from witnesses arrived daily. Investigators compiled interviews into timelines. Pilots submitted logs outlining unusual maneuvers that did not match any aircraft they had ever seen. Over time, hundreds of cases accumulated, some widely discussed, others quietly tucked away. Amid these were the 10 under-examined files that formed the focus of this journey. Each was documented with care, yet each slipped through the cracks of mainstream history, overshadowed by more dramatic stories or buried under shifting priorities. They represent a moment when attention to detail mattered deeply, when every report was considered a potential clue to something larger. Looking back on this forgotten era of investigation invites a sense of calm reflection. The world was tense, yet the act of studying the unknown was carried out with patience and restraint. Investigators did not rush their conclusions. They allowed space for uncertainty, for the possibility that answers might emerge slowly or not at all. As you imagine these early researchers working quietly at their desks, sorting through pilot statements or correlating radar data, there's a softness in recognizing the sincerity of their effort. They were not seeking fame or excitement. They were seeking understanding. And in reopening their files now, you step gently into that same mode of contemplation, allowing the mysteries of the past to unfold at their own pace, just as they once did in the hands of those who documented them. The first file you lift from the quiet NICAP archive feels slightly heavier than expected, as if the years wrapped around it have given it a weight of their own. Inside are 3 cases, each involving the silent vastness of the upper atmosphere, where pilots glide above the world in darkened cockpits, trusting their instruments, their training, and the steady rhythm of engine hum. High-altitude encounters hold a special place in UFO research because they involve observers who live their professional lives in the sky. Their senses are conditioned by thousands of hours in flight, their attention sharpened by routine safety checks, and the expectation that any anomaly must be understood quickly and clearly. When such individuals report something unusual, it carries a gravity that commands careful attention. NICAP treated these accounts not as distant curiosities, but as important fragments of a larger pattern. The first case unfolds aboard a commercial aircraft moving smoothly across a quiet night sky, the cabin dim and passengers asleep beneath soft blankets. The pilot and co-pilot, accustomed to long stretches of stillness interrupted only by radio calls, notice an object pacing their altitude. It glows faintly, not blinking like standard aviation lights, and moves with a deliberate steadiness that doesn't match known aircraft. The co-pilot checks the radar screen. Nothing. The object maintains its position for several minutes, and then, without accelerating or turning in any way familiar to aviation professionals, it simply shifts direction and disappears. NICAP investigators later interviewed both pilots separately, finding their statements nearly identical in timing, description, and emotional tone. This consistency impressed the investigators, especially since neither pilot was inclined toward dramatic interpretations. Official responses suggested misidentified stars or reflections, yet the pilots rejected that explanation confidently, noting their familiarity with both. The second case emerges from a military training flight. A young pilot, crisp in his discipline and still early in his career, reports an object executing sharp angular maneuvers far beyond what his aircraft could manage. He initially suspects a foreign reconnaissance craft, something experimental, perhaps belonging to a nation pushing the limits of aeronautical engineering. But the altitude, speed, and sudden stops challenge that idea. Radar at the nearby base briefly detected an irregular return, then lost it, then captured it again at a higher altitude. These intermittent blips puzzle the operators because they did not align with the predictable behavior of aircraft or known atmospheric distortions. When NICAP obtained the pilot statement, they noted his calm, almost reluctant tone. He was not someone seeking attention. In fact, he expressed concern that reporting such an encounter might affect his reputation. That hesitation itself spoke volumes. Professionals rarely risk their standing unless they are deeply certain of what they observed. The third case carries a quieter atmosphere, unfolding during a routine night flight over the open ocean. The pilot observed what appeared to be a structured craft illuminated by a pale, diffuse glow. It hovered in place, far above sea level, motionless against the wind. The aircraft's onboard radar indicated a faint, inconsistent reading, just enough to confirm that something of physical substance was present. The pilot contacted a nearby vessel, asking whether they had any visual confirmation. They did not, but they reported an unusual interference in their communication equipment at the same time. NICAP investigators later pieced together these overlapping fragments, noting that while evidence was sparse, the combination of visual observation, radar echo, and secondary interference made the incident particularly intriguing. When the official explanation later attributed the event to radar clutter, NICAP found that phrasing inadequate, since clutter does not typically produce structured shapes or synchronized communication anomalies. What connects these three cases is the consistency of professionalism. Each involved trained observers who had no incentive to exaggerate or invent. Their reports were delivered in the calm, precise language of individuals who viewed the sky not as a source of fantasy, but as a workplace governed by physics, procedure, and predictability. NICAP treated such witnesses with respect, not because they believed every detail without question, but because they understood the context in which pilots operate. These were individuals who recognized aircraft silhouettes by habit, who could distinguish between atmospheric distortions and solid objects, who knew that misidentifications in their line of work could have serious consequences. The calm pacing of these accounts becomes almost soothing when revisited now. They reflect a time when investigations were conducted slowly, deliberately, and with a certain intimacy. Interviews were typed on mechanical typewriters. Radar logs were photocopied, annotated, and slipped into labeled folders. Everything moved at a human pace, unhurried and thorough. There is a tranquility in imagining those investigators sitting at their desks late at night, reviewing testimony under warm lamplight, cross-referencing timelines, and noticing quiet consistencies others might overlook. Although none of these cases reached widespread recognition, they formed a subtle backbone in NICAP's internal discussions. The organization often cited high-altitude encounters as the most credible category of sightings, not because they proved anything definitively, but because they demonstrated patterns that resisted conventional explanation. At times, skeptics suggested experimental aircraft or classified reconnaissance missions. And while these explanations had merit, they struggled to account for the sudden accelerations and silent maneuvers described by seasoned pilots. At other times, analysts considered atmospheric reflections. But such explanations faltered when faced with structured shapes or clear radar correlations. The unresolved tension between official responses and eyewitness certainty, created a persistent sense of quiet mystery. As you reflect on these three encounters, the night grows deeper, and the pace of the narrative slows to a gentle drift. What the pilots saw may never be known with absolute clarity, yet their sincerity remains unmistakable. These cases do not shout for attention, they whisper. They invite contemplation rather than conclusion. And in that soft space between what is known and what remains unexplained, you can feel the calm presence of the sky itself, vast, watchful, and filled with mysteries that unfold one quiet moment at a time. The next file from the NICAP archive opens to two cases that bring the focus closer to the earth, where the hum of daily life mixes with the unknown. These are ground-level encounters, moments when ordinary people, going about their quiet routines, glimpse something that did not belong to the predictable world around them. There is a subtle difference here compared to high-altitude incidents. The witnesses are not pilots or radar operators, but farmers, night shift workers, and local law enforcement officers. Their perspective carries a human intimacy, a blend of awe and apprehension that makes these accounts particularly compelling. They are encounters that unfold in familiar settings: a lonely country road, a dimly lit farmhouse, a quiet field under a crescent moon, where every shadow and sound is amplified in the stillness of night. In the first case, a farmer walking back from his barn late in the evening noticed a series of lights hovering above his cornfield. At first, he thought it might be a low-flying aircraft, yet the lights maintained a perfectly symmetrical pattern, moving slowly in formation before vanishing without sound. The man, accustomed to rural solitude and nocturnal noises, described the event calmly, as though recounting a simple observation rather than a shocking spectacle. NICAP investigators took note of his precise timeline and the way he distinguished between familiar sounds and the quiet presence of the unknown. They also considered environmental factors, weather patterns, atmospheric phenomena, and possible reflections, but none fully explained the experience. The farmer's account was striking in its simplicity, a measured description of something unexplainable, delivered without embellishment. The second case involved a small-town police officer patrolling a quiet stretch of highway. As he drove along the empty road, his headlights briefly illuminated a triangular craft hovering silently just above the tree line. The vehicle had no visible propulsion system, no sound, and reflected the pale glow of streetlights in an otherworldly manner. The officer's training emphasized observation and careful reporting. His logbooks were filled with procedural notes and traffic incidents. In documenting the encounter, NICAP found his testimony unusually reliable, noting that he compared the sighting against other known aircraft patterns, checked the surrounding terrain, and ensured his description remained factual. The officer also mentioned a subtle, almost imperceptible hum, which disappeared as suddenly as the craft did. In the subsequent official summary, the sighting was attributed to a misidentified vehicle or light, yet the details in the NICAP file suggested a presence far more structured and deliberate than any conventional source could explain. Both cases offer insight into the psychology of witnessing unusual phenomena. Human perception is sensitive to context, environment, and expectation. At night, low-light conditions can sharpen focus or create illusions, and yet NICAP's careful methodology often helped distinguish between ordinary misinterpretations and genuinely puzzling events. Investigators would interview each witness separately, sometimes multiple times, noting consistency in narrative, gestures, and timing. When two or more independent accounts converged on the same sequence of events, the reliability of the observation increased, though complete explanation might remain elusive. This delicate balance between the credibility of witnesses and the mysterious nature of what they reported is at the heart of NICAP's approach. In analyzing these encounters, NICAP often juxtaposed reports against known aerial activity. Flight plans, local airport traffic, and experimental aircraft tests were cross-referenced to rule out conventional causes. Weather conditions were meticulously documented. Cloud cover, wind patterns, atmospheric refraction, and even electrical phenomena were considered. In many ground-level sightings, these factors could explain certain aspects, such as shimmering lights or unusual reflections, yet the structure, movement, and behavior of the objects themselves resisted simple explanation. NICAP notes often highlight this tension between natural causes and the inexplicable, leaving an open-ended space where wonder and skepticism coexist quietly. The cultural context of the 1960s adds another layer of depth. This was a period of space exploration, growing fascination with extraterrestrial life, and a media landscape eager for stories of otherworldly phenomena. Civilians reported encounters in a climate where imagination and reality were often intertwined. Yet NICAP's documentation emphasized method over myth. Witnesses were asked to describe what they saw with as little interpretation as possible, to focus on shape, movement, and duration rather than assigning motives or intent. The files reveal that even ordinary people, when guided carefully, can provide remarkably detailed and measured accounts of phenomena that remain otherwise unexplainable. These two cases also underscore the way NICAP approached empathy in investigation. They treated witnesses with care, acknowledging the emotional weight of seeing something outside normal experience. The farmer's quiet reflection, the officer's disciplined observation, both are examples of how human reaction is part of the story, not a distraction from it. NICAP understood that fear, wonder, and the instinctive desire to rationalize events all shaped the account. Yet through careful questioning, cross-referencing, and contextual analysis, investigators could extract a coherent narrative that remained calm and credible. As you move through these files, there is a certain serenity in observing how ordinary nights became extraordinary for those who witnessed them. There is no urgency, no dramatic crescendo, only the gentle unfolding of events and the meticulous care of those who documented them. The light hovering above a cornfield, the silent triangle above a dark highway. These are moments that linger softly, carrying the subtle tension of mystery without alarm. They invite contemplation, a gentle awareness that even in the familiar, the world can hold secrets that defy explanation. And as you imagine each witness recounting their experience, the room of archival files seems to breathe softly, each page offering a quiet reflection on the balance between human perception and the enduring enigma of the night sky. One of the most compelling files in the NICAP archive involves a case that bridges both the technological precision of radar and the human acuity of visual observation. This particular incident unfolded in the early 1960s, during a routine training flight that began quietly, with nothing unusual to suggest the extraordinary would soon occur. Pilots were accustomed to monitoring their instruments and scanning the sky for standard air traffic, but on this night, multiple systems simultaneously registered something entirely unfamiliar. The radar operator first noticed a small, consistent blip that appeared at an altitude and speed inconsistent with any known aircraft. Moments later, the same object was visually observed by the pilot, hovering steadily and then darting in a manner that defied conventional aerodynamics. The concurrence of visual and radar evidence immediately drew NICAP's attention, as it represented one of the rare instances where two separate modalities of observation aligned perfectly. Investigators approached the case with methodical care. The radar log showed intermittent traces, often disappearing and reappearing at slightly different positions. NICAP analysts pored over these records, comparing them with known flight paths, atmospheric conditions, and the capabilities of experimental military craft of the time. While some suggested that radar anomalies could account for the observations, the pilot's testimony added a dimension that instruments alone could not provide. He described the object as having a defined shape, a steady glow, and movements that were deliberate rather than random. The language of the report was precise, noting angles of ascent, changes in velocity, and even minor fluctuations in the craft's apparent distance. Such attention to detail helped NICAP maintain credibility, as they relied not on conjecture, but on observable phenomena that could be measured, compared, and analyzed. The juxtaposition between official records and NICAP's findings is particularly intriguing in this instance. When the Air Force reviewed the case, their report summarized it as a probable misidentification of a conventional aircraft or atmospheric effect. NICAP investigators, however, noted several inconsistencies. The blips appeared in locations where no flights were scheduled, and the pilot's visual confirmation did not correspond with any known weather or astronomical phenomena. The difference between official interpretation and civilian analysis highlights a recurring theme in the files: a tension between institutional caution and investigative curiosity. NICAP's team did not leap to the conclusion that the object was extraterrestrial, but they insisted on documenting what they could, recognizing that uncertainty did not negate the validity of observation. Psychologically, radar visual incidents are fascinating because they involve two separate systems of perception: the mechanical and the human. Radar provides a cold, objective measurement, yet it is subject to anomalies, reflections, and signal errors. Human observation, in contrast, is sensitive to context, expectation, and perception biases, yet can capture detail that instruments may not register, such as shape, light quality, and behavior patterns. In this case, the convergence of both forms of data created a rare reliability. NICAP files emphasize the careful interviews conducted with the pilot, the step-by-step reconstruction of the radar traces, and the cross-referencing with external sources, such as nearby flight towers. The result is a case that is both meticulously documented and quietly mysterious, inviting reflection rather than speculation. This incident also illustrates the challenges of timing and documentation during the era. Unlike modern systems with digital storage and instant replication, all radar logs were manually recorded, often typed or written by hand, and visual observations were entered in separate notebooks. Maintaining accuracy required patience and care, and NICAP recognized the importance of cross-verifying each element. The process could take days, sometimes weeks, during which investigators would review weather charts, contact other radar stations, and conduct multiple interviews. This deliberate pace, though slow by contemporary standards, ensured a level of scrutiny that many modern accounts lack. The files themselves, now yellowed with age, carry the weight of those meticulous hours, a record of careful attention to detail in pursuit of understanding. As the narrative unfolds, it is impossible to ignore the cultural and historical context of such encounters. The Cold War atmosphere meant that both pilots and investigators were acutely aware of national security concerns. Any unidentified object could represent a foreign technological advancement or a classified domestic project. NICAP, though civilian, operated with sensitivity to these realities. They documented everything with precise language, careful diagrams, and conservative interpretations, avoiding hyperbole while leaving space for genuine anomaly. The files show repeated notes emphasizing that the object's behavior exceeded known capabilities, yet without venturing into unsupported speculation. This balance between observation and restraint is part of what gives these records their calm, credible weight, even as the events themselves remain unresolved. Finally, there is a quiet beauty in the pacing of this story. Unlike sensationalized reports, the incident unfolds gradually, allowing space for thought, reflection, and gentle tension. Listeners are drawn into the perspective of the observer, guided along by the soft rhythm of description rather than jolted by dramatic flourishes. The radar sweeps, the careful logs, the step-by-step verification, all contribute to a sense of measured contemplation. The case ends not with a dramatic resolution, but with lingering uncertainty, a subtle invitation to imagine possibilities while remaining grounded in careful documentation. In this stillness, there is both intrigue and relaxation, as the mystery of the night sky settles gently over the observer, the investigators, and now the listener. One of the most enigmatic files in the NICAP archive focuses on a single incident that has long fascinated researchers due to its combination of radar detection and multiple eyewitness confirmations. Unlike other sightings that relied solely on either visual accounts or instrument readings, this case presented a rare convergence. Ground-based radar operators, airborne radar systems, and several pilots all reported the same unusual object at nearly the same time. It began on a calm night, with skies clear and visibility excellent, creating conditions ideal for observation. The first detection occurred when a radar technician noticed an anomalous blip moving at a speed and altitude inconsistent with any scheduled aircraft. Moments later, a nearby pilot, following a standard training route, observed a strange light in the sky, which corresponded precisely with the radar reading. The object hovered, then executed maneuvers that seemed impossible for conventional technology, disappearing and reappearing across the horizon in a pattern that defied prediction. NICAP's investigators approached the case with the patience and precision for which the organization was known. They collected every available piece of evidence. Radar logs were copied and analyzed, pilot statements were taken separately and in detail, and weather conditions were meticulously documented. Notes included wind speed, cloud cover, and any atmospheric anomalies that might explain optical illusions or radar distortion. They also reached out to nearby airfields and communication towers, cross-checking flight plans, and confirming that no experimental aircraft or military exercises were scheduled. Despite these efforts, the anomaly remained unexplained. NICAP's careful documentation emphasized not just the events themselves, but the reliability of the witnesses, trained observers whose professional experience added weight to their descriptions. The official records present a stark contrast. The Air Force, when reviewing the incident, concluded that it likely involved misidentified conventional aircraft, temperature inversions, or radar interference. NICAP, however, highlighted specific inconsistencies in these explanations. The radar returns did not match the speed, size, or trajectory of any known aircraft, and the visual observations reported movements that no plane at the time could perform. NICAP's files even note small, subtle discrepancies, slight variations in radar signatures, changes in the object's apparent altitude, and a consistency in pilot testimonies that defy chance. This gap between institutional interpretation and meticulous civilian investigation underscores a recurring theme in the archive: the tension between cautious dismissal and patient curiosity. Psychologically, radar visual cases are particularly compelling because they involve both human perception and mechanical instrumentation. Radar provides objective data, though it is subject to anomalies such as reflections, interference, or equipment error. Human observation, in contrast, is shaped by attention, expectation, and sensory limitations, yet it can capture qualities like shape, color, and motion patterns that instruments cannot quantify. In this case, the alignment of these two forms of evidence created a rare degree of reliability, compelling investigators to consider possibilities beyond routine explanations. NICAP files record detailed interviews with pilots, noting their calm demeanor, precise recollection, and consistent articulation of movements and light characteristics, all of which supported the credibility of the observations. Part of the intrigue lies in the object's behavior. Unlike conventional aircraft, which follow predictable flight patterns and respond according to aerodynamic principles, this craft seemed to disregard those limitations. It would hover silently, then accelerate almost instantaneously before pausing again, leaving radar operators scrambling to reconcile the blips with known possibilities. Pilots described an object with a defined geometric shape, illuminated faintly yet steadily, moving with a deliberate intelligence rather than randomness. NICAP analysts were careful not to claim a definitive explanation. Instead, they focused on documenting the anomaly in detail, noting where official accounts diverged from the eyewitness events. This approach preserves the integrity of the data while leaving room for interpretation, a hallmark of NICAP's meticulous methodology. The historical context of the early 1960s adds further nuance to the case. Cold War anxieties were high, and both the U.S. and its adversaries were actively testing new aircraft, missiles, and reconnaissance technologies. Pilots and radar operators were trained to identify foreign threats, and yet none of the official records could account for what was observed. NICAP's files reflect their awareness of this environment, emphasizing that the unknown object could have represented any number of possibilities, from experimental aircraft to unrecognized atmospheric phenomena. Yet the careful combination of human observation and radar tracking meant the case could not be easily dismissed as misperception or error. making it one of the organization's most compelling documented anomalies. Equally fascinating is the deliberate, unhurried pace of NICAP's investigation. Unlike sensationalized reports that emphasize dramatic revelation, this case unfolded gradually, with careful cross-referencing, repeated interviews, and methodical verification of all details. Radar logs were examined minute by minute, pilot statements were compared for consistency, and environmental factors were cataloged exhaustively. Investigators resisted the urge to draw immediate conclusions, allowing the data to speak for itself. This deliberate approach creates a calm, contemplative rhythm when reviewing the case, an unusual blend of technical rigor and gentle suspense. In the end, the object's final movements remain unresolved. It vanished from radar and sight without trace, leaving behind nothing but precise records, detailed statements, and a lingering sense of wonder. There is no dramatic conclusion, only the quiet acknowledgement that something unexplained occurred, observed by multiple, reliable sources. In revisiting the files now, one is struck not by fear or excitement, but by the measured care with which investigators recorded every detail. The stillness of the night, the steady hum of radar, the meticulous notes on pilot observations. All of these combine to create a story that is at once mysterious and soothing, inviting the listener to contemplate the unknown while remaining grounded in the careful documentation of those who witnessed it. Two cases in the NICAP archive stand out for their proximity to sensitive military facilities, places where the hum of surveillance, security protocols, and restricted access created an unusual tension with the quiet mystery of the skies. In the first incident, a small military installation situated near a remote valley became the focal point of multiple reports from night shift personnel. Lights appeared over the facility, moving in ways that defied conventional flight patterns. Security cameras, primitive by modern standards, captured fleeting glimpses of structured shapes hovering above the perimeter, while radar operators recorded blips that accelerated and decelerated with precision impossible for any aircraft known at the time. NICAP investigators later reconstructed the timeline, cross-referencing shifts, logs, and communication records to ensure the incident was not a misinterpretation of routine operations. Yet even after exhaustive analysis, the anomaly persisted, unexplained but meticulously documented. The second case involved a nearby missile testing range. A group of technicians observed unusual formations in the night sky, lights that appeared and disappeared with uncanny synchronization. They initially assumed foreign reconnaissance, though the location's strict security protocols and the lack of corresponding radar evidence made that explanation unlikely. Witnesses described a series of geometric lights, moving both in formation and independently, with some ascending or halting abruptly in ways that no conventional craft could achieve. NICAP files emphasize the credibility of these observers, trained personnel familiar with aircraft identification, missile trajectories, and experimental test protocols. Their consistency, combined with the lack of alternative explanations, made this case particularly striking. NICAP's approach to these incidents was methodical. Investigators first ensured that all possible conventional explanations were explored. Routine military exercises, scheduled flights, atmospheric phenomena, and astronomical events. In both cases, these factors were insufficient. Radar anomalies and visual observations suggested a presence more deliberate than random reflections or misidentified aircraft. Detailed witness statements included descriptions of light intensity, color variations, formation patterns, and apparent size, information that was later cross-referenced with any known aerospace activity. NICAP analysts often noted in their margins that the unexplained behavior exceeded the capabilities of contemporary technology, a quiet acknowledgement that something extraordinary had occurred. The psychological dimension of these encounters is subtle but significant. Observers near sensitive facilities carry a heightened awareness of security protocols and operational anomalies. Their training instills vigilance and a reliance on procedure, meaning their observations are often precise and cautious. NICAP's files reflect an understanding that the witness's reactions, ranging from initial surprise to analytical reflection, were part of the narrative. The investigators documented not only what was seen, but how observers perceived it, noting how stress, expectation, and situational awareness shaped their accounts. The combination of professional training and spontaneous experience makes these encounters particularly valuable from both an analytical and narrative perspective. These incidents also highlight the tension between public transparency and national security. Military and government agencies often withheld details from NICAP investigators, citing classified operations. Correspondence in the files shows polite, formal requests for information, sometimes met with partial responses or denials. NICAP analysts were careful to respect these boundaries while continuing to document observations, carefully noting gaps in available data. This delicate balance between curiosity and protocol underscores the careful, patient methodology that permeates NICAP's work, ensuring that each report is both credible and complete, even when official cooperation is limited. The historical context of the Cold War further enriches these cases. The early 1960s were marked by rapid technological innovation and high-stakes geopolitical maneuvering. The possibility of foreign aircraft or surveillance drones could never be dismissed lightly, yet NICAP's analyses often found no correspondence between reported phenomena and known military programs. In addition, media reporting of these incidents was muted, either because facilities were remote or because information was deliberately restricted. In many ways, these cases remained hidden, quietly awaiting rediscovery in the pages of NICAP's carefully maintained archives. This interplay between secrecy and observation adds a layer of tension to the narrative, creating a quiet suspense without resorting to sensationalism. The encounters near sensitive sites also illustrate NICAP's emphasis on multiple forms of evidence. Visual observation, radar detection, and environmental documentation were combined to provide a robust picture of the incidents. Notes indicate that investigators cross-checked with nearby civilian radar, reviewed meteorological reports, and even consulted local astronomy enthusiasts to rule out celestial explanations. This methodical approach reinforces the credibility of the files and demonstrates the care with which investigators treated each witness statement. The cases are compelling not because they provide immediate answers, but because they show the disciplined pursuit of understanding, a calm inquiry into phenomena that remained otherwise unaccounted for. Finally, these files leave the reader or listener with a sense of unresolved wonder. The objects observed near restricted facilities vanished without trace, leaving only detailed logs, precise eyewitness accounts, and the quiet hum of unanswered questions. The narrative unfolds slowly, emphasizing patience and observation over drama, allowing the mystery to breathe. The combination of credible witnesses, corroborating data, and official ambiguity creates a subtle tension, inviting contemplation rather than alarm. As you imagine the scene, a darkened security tower, the soft glow of radar screens, the faint lights drifting silently above the perimeter, you can feel both the weight of history and the gentle pull of curiosity. The mystery persists, lingering softly in the night, and it is this balance of precision, restraint, and wonder that makes these NICAP files so quietly compelling. As the NICAP archive widens before you, it becomes clear that the story of these forgotten cases extends far beyond individual sightings. They exist within a broader tapestry of government, media, and cultural dynamics that shaped public perception of UFOs for decades. During the mid-20th century, the U.S. Air Force maintained Project Blue Book, a program tasked with investigating unidentified aerial phenomena while also managing public perception. Official reports often leaned toward conventional explanations, emphasizing misidentified aircraft, balloons, or natural atmospheric phenomena. NICAP, in contrast, pursued a more open-ended approach, valuing witness testimony and systematic documentation over dismissal. The tension between these two approaches, one prioritizing national security and public calm, the other prioritizing thorough investigation, defined much of a landscape in which these 10 forgotten cases unfolded. Media coverage of UFO phenomena evolved significantly during this period. In the 1950s, newspapers and magazines often treated sightings as serious, factual events, reporting pilot statements, radar anomalies, and government memos in measured tones. By the 1960s and 1970s, however, sensationalist reporting began to dominate. UFOs became a topic of entertainment as much as inquiry, with television shows, science fiction stories, and late-night commentary framing the subject in dramatic, sometimes exaggerated ways. NICAP's files reveal a quiet frustration among investigators, who observed that nuanced, carefully documented reports were often overshadowed by stories designed for spectacle. The 10 forgotten cases, meticulously recorded and cross-verified, were particularly vulnerable to this shift, disappearing from the public, even as their credibility remained intact. Government attitudes toward UFOs also contributed to the obscurity of these cases. While congressional hearings occasionally addressed the phenomenon, interest often waned when reports failed to yield immediate, actionable conclusions. Declassified memos and correspondence show that some agencies were reluctant to release information, citing national security or the potential for public panic. NICAP researchers documented these hurdles, noting when files were partially redacted, delayed, or denied entirely. The organization's persistence, despite bureaucratic obstacles, is evident throughout the records. They sought access to radar data, military flight logs, and communications records, often receiving only fragments, yet they maintained careful notation of every unanswered request. These gaps in documentation add an element of quiet tension to the cases, highlighting the persistent challenge of understanding phenomena that intersected with both civilian and classified interests. The cultural impact of NICAP's work extends beyond individual reports. The organization helped shape early UFO research standards, emphasizing systematic investigation, witness credibility, and corroborating evidence. Their methods influenced later civilian groups, academic inquiries, and even governmental programs in the 21st century. Researchers and historians note that while sensational stories may capture public imagination, NICAP's disciplined approach provides a reliable foundation for understanding the phenomenon. In revisiting these 10 forgotten cases, one can trace patterns of observation, the interaction of human perception with environmental factors, and the subtle tension between official explanations and eyewitness testimony. These elements combine to create a narrative that is both informative and immersive, allowing the listener to follow the story without urgency or alarm. Particularly noteworthy in this section of the archive is the documentation of investigative methodology. NICAP files reveal detailed interviews conducted separately with multiple witnesses, careful logging of environmental conditions, and precise reconstruction of flight paths and object trajectories. They recorded both the statements themselves and the manner in which they were delivered, the tone, hesitation, and confidence of witnesses, which added an additional layer of analysis. Such thorough documentation was uncommon for the era and underscores the organization's commitment to credibility. By combining these methods with careful attention to radar data and photographic evidence, NICAP created records that remain valuable today, offering insight into both the phenomena and the people who observe them. The tension between official narratives and NICAP's findings is another recurring theme. While Project Blue Book often attributed sightings to conventional explanations, NICAP investigators noted instances where these conclusions did not align with the observations of trained professionals. In some cases, radar logs or pilot testimonies contradicted official reports, creating an understated but persistent sense of mystery. NICAP's files are meticulous in documenting these discrepancies, not to sensationalize, but to preserve the integrity of the record. This careful balance between skepticism, curiosity, and respectful acknowledgement of the unknown contributes to the calm, measured tone that defines the organization's work and sets these cases apart from more sensational accounts. Revisiting these files today also highlights the ongoing process of rediscovery and reassessment. Declassification initiatives, digital archiving, and renewed scholarly interest have brought many forgotten cases back into consideration. Modern analysts, with access to advanced radar analysis, atmospheric modeling, and historical cross-referencing, can revisit NICAP's documentation with fresh eyes. Yet even with contemporary tools, the cases retain elements that remain unexplained, preserving their subtle intrigue. There is a quiet satisfaction in this. The files are neither fully resolved nor discarded, allowing them to exist as living records that bridge past and present inquiry. Finally, these archival explorations remind us that the story of NICAP is not merely about UFOs. It is about the process of inquiry itself. The organization represents a patient, deliberate pursuit of understanding, one that respects both human perception and technological evidence. The 10 forgotten cases, once overlooked or dismissed, now offer a calm, immersive journey through observation, documentation, and contemplation. In this space, one can reflect on the interplay between official authority, public perception, and individual experience, recognizing that even unresolved mysteries have value. They teach patience, the importance of careful attention, and the quiet power of curiosity, a power that endures softly across decades of observation and reflection. In recent years, the 10 forgotten NICAP files have taken on new life under the scrutiny of modern researchers, scientists, and aviation experts. While these cases were meticulously documented decades ago, contemporary technology allows us to revisit them with tools that investigators at the time could only imagine. Satellite tracking, advanced radar analysis, and access to declassified aerospace programs provide additional lenses through which to interpret the data. Yet despite these advancements, many elements of the sightings remain unresolved, preserving their quiet intrigue. The process of reassessment is not about sensationalizing the unknown. Rather, it is a careful, deliberate effort to compare historical observation with contemporary understanding, bridging the gap between past curiosity and present capability. One of the most significant aspects of this reevaluation is the ability to analyze radar records in ways that were previously impossible. Digitization of old logs, combined with computer modeling, allows researchers to reconstruct flight paths, estimate speeds, and compare anomalies against known aircraft trajectories. In some cases, modern analysis suggests plausible explanations for certain blips or movements, such as experimental aircraft testing or atmospheric interference. Yet other sightings resist explanation even under this rigorous examination. The convergence of human observation and historical radar documentation in these files often presents scenarios that defy the capabilities of known aircraft of the era. This tension between plausible modern explanations and persistent anomalies is part of what makes the NICAP files both credible and quietly mysterious. Visual observations are also reassessed through contemporary frameworks. Pilot statements, civilian accounts, and law enforcement testimonies are examined not only for what was reported, but for the psychological and environmental context in which the sightings occurred. Modern investigators consider factors such as night vision limitations, perspective distortion, and atmospheric conditions that can alter perception. Even with these considerations, many accounts maintain consistency and reliability. The deliberate, calm nature of NICAP's original interviews, witnesses asked to describe shape, color, movement, and duration without embellishment, provides a stable foundation for modern comparison. It becomes evident that these cases were not the product of hysteria or imagination. They were carefully observed phenomena documented by trained and conscientious individuals. The contemporary reassessment also benefits from access to declassified military programs. Some incidents, once mysterious, can now be contextualized against previously secret aircraft or reconnaissance missions. In certain cases, the timing, location, and behavior of the object can be partially explained through this lens. Yet for many of the 10 files, these explanations are insufficient. The object's acceleration, hovering capability, and sudden directional shifts often exceed what would be possible with technology of the 1960s, even accounting for experimental prototypes. NICAP's original insistence on thorough documentation and cross-verification remains a guiding principle, demonstrating that careful observation can withstand decades of scrutiny without losing credibility. Cultural and historical context continues to play an important role in reassessment. These cases occurred during an era of intense technological innovation, Cold War tension, and public fascination with space exploration. Understanding the mindset of witnesses, whether pilots trained to observe subtle differences in aircraft, civilians interpreting unfamiliar lights in the night sky, or military personnel aware of security protocols, enhances comprehension of the reports. Modern analysis often combines historical context with physical data, revealing layers of subtle detail that were either unavailable or overlooked at the time. NICAP's meticulous records allow researchers to reconstruct these scenarios with clarity, preserving the integrity of the original observations while exploring new angles of interpretation. One of the most striking outcomes of modern review is the persistence of mystery. Despite advanced analytical techniques, some phenomena in the NICAP files continue to resist explanation. These anomalies, objects with structured shapes, precise movement, and corroborated visual and radar evidence, invite a quiet contemplation rather than urgent conclusion. They challenge assumptions, not with alarm, but with a steady suggestion that the world may still hold moments that elude full comprehension. The files do not demand belief in any specific theory. They demand attention, patience, and careful consideration. In this way, they remain profoundly instructive for both researchers and curious observers alike. Another compelling aspect of modern analysis is the opportunity to compare these historical cases to contemporary sightings. Recent UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, reports, some now acknowledged by official agencies, show striking parallels in behavior, scale, and observation. This continuity suggests that while technology and documentation have evolved, the underlying phenomena remain consistent. The NICAP cases, therefore, are not isolated curiosities, but part of a broader continuum of investigation. By revisiting these files, modern analysts can trace patterns of observation, witness reliability, and investigative rigor, enriching the historical and scientific record simultaneously. Finally, the act of reassessment emphasizes the enduring value of NICAP's methodology. The combination of calm, deliberate interviews, rigorous cross-referencing, and careful documentation ensures that these cases can withstand decades of technological and analytical change. They illustrate the power of disciplined observation and meticulous record-keeping, offering lessons for contemporary researchers seeking to approach unexplained phenomena without sensationalism. The 10 forgotten files once overlooked now stand as enduring examples of patience, curiosity, and careful inquiry. They invite reflection, fostering a sense of calm intrigue as we trace the intersection of human perception, environmental complexity, and the persistent mysteries of the night sky. As the final folder is carefully lifted from the NICAP archive, a gentle stillness seems to settle over the room. There is a sense of completion, yet also a quiet lingering, as though the past itself exhales, leaving faint traces of mystery behind. These 10 forgotten cases, each meticulously documented, offer more than accounts of unexplained aerial phenomena. They provide a meditation on human observation, patience, and the subtle interplay between certainty and wonder. Reaching this point, one cannot help but reflect on the nature of investigation itself, and the way that curiosity, grounded in rigor, allows the mind to explore the unknown without alarm or haste. Each case, whether high in the sky, hovering silently over a cornfield, or observed near a sensitive military installation, shares a common thread: the careful documentation of credible witnesses encountering something beyond immediate understanding. Pilots, police officers, farmers, and radar operators all provided observations measured in detail, recorded with attention to timing, trajectory, and environmental factors. NICAP's meticulous method, interviewing witnesses separately, cross-referencing radar data, examining weather conditions, and noting psychological context, created a record that balances mystery with credibility. These files do not demand acceptance of any particular explanation. Instead, they invite reflection on the limitations of knowledge and the extraordinary care with which humans can perceive and record phenomena. There is also a subtle rhythm to the archive, a pacing that feels almost deliberate. Unlike sensationalized reports, which rush to conclusion or dramatize the unknown, These cases unfold gently, allowing each detail to be absorbed. A pilot notes the precise angle of a hovering craft. A radar operator records intermittent blips on a log. A farmer describes the pattern of lights over a quiet field. Over decades, these moments accumulate, forming a mosaic of observation that is both precise and quietly mysterious. The calm cadence of these records is soothing, providing a form of narrative meditation as the mind contemplates what is seen and what remains unseen. Revisiting these files also highlights the interplay between human perception and the limits of contemporary technology. In the 1960s, radar was powerful but imperfect, and photographic equipment was rudimentary by modern standards. Witnesses relied on their training, experience, and attention to detail to describe what they observed. NICAP's methodology respected this human dimension, recognizing that perception is shaped by context, expectation, and environmental conditions. By combining mechanical data with eyewitness accounts, the investigators created a layered record that continues to offer insight decades later. There is a quiet reassurance in this approach. Even in the absence of complete understanding, careful observation can stand the test of time. The broader cultural and historical context further enriches the reflection. The Cold War era, with its technological acceleration and geopolitical tension, created an environment in which the skies were simultaneously familiar and enigmatic. Public fascination with space, coupled with secrecy surrounding military innovation, meant that unexplained aerial phenomena captured both professional attention and popular imagination. NICAP's files document this intersection without sensationalism, preserving the human experience of curiosity, caution, and awe. In this sense, the archive is as much a record of human response to mystery as it is of the phenomena themselves. Modern reassessment continues to add layers of depth. Contemporary analysts, using digitized radar logs, satellite imagery, and declassified aerospace data, revisit these cases with fresh eyes. Some anomalies find partial explanation through experimental aircraft or atmospheric conditions, yet many behaviors, hovering, rapid acceleration, precise directional changes, remain unaccounted for. These unresolved elements maintain the subtle tension between the known and unknown, fostering an atmosphere of calm curiosity rather than fear.